And among those we'll be chatting with is Claudia Chender, leader of the NDP here in Nova Scotia. Claudia Chender, hello.
Good morning, Todd.
Feels like there's not many people working today, just you and me perhaps, and Vanessa. What do you think?
I know, it's a pretty sleepy summer morning out there. I just dropped my kids off at the lake. They're definitely not working.
For sure. And sounds good. All right, so let's talk. Let's get to work, and there's still some very important things to talk about. First off, I know that people are probably sick to death of talking about this carbon tax, and people are going to become more sick to death of paying it, I'm sure. But is there anything you can add to the conversation from a provincial vantage point that could be done or should have been done as far as the provincial government here goes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the reality is, Todd, that we've known that pricing on carbon has been part of the federal government's plan for years and years. And so we avoided the first round somewhat through a cap and trade system, which by all accounts was not that successful in actually doing it much to meet our climate commitments, but did avoid that surge at the pumps. The price went up, the cap and trade didn't work anymore, and instead of trying to negotiate with the federal government, make sure that Nova Scotians were, as taken care of as possible during this pricing transition, the federal government threw up their hands. The provincial government threw up their hands and picked a fight. And that's where we are right now. Now, it's important that listeners understand, because the Tories' ad campaign does not tell them this, that there is a rebate coming. Nova Scotians will be getting quarterly checks. And for many Nova Scotians, that will cover the cost. There's even an increased check that goes to folks in rural areas who have more of a reliance on driving. But nonetheless, the parliamentary budget officer has said that, some Nova Scotians will not cover those costs. And so from a provincial standpoint, I think what the government could do, which we've been calling on them to do for a really long time, is to help with affordability. And you and I have talked about a lot of those ideas: freezing pharmacare fees so people can afford their medicine, cutting the tax on groceries, raising the threshold for student loan repayment, raising permanently the threshold for heating assistance, and also continuing to really ramp up that efficiency spending so that, things like fuel oil and furnace oil, people don't have to deal with anymore because they'll be transitioning to cleaner options. So there's a lot that the government can do. And instead of kind of rolling up their sleeves and doing that work, we have a provincial government who's decided that there's a political advantage in picking a fight with Ottawa. And some people will like to see that. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to do a lot for people's pocketbooks, and it's not going to do a lot for our climate.
All right, cutting perhaps the portion of the provincial sales tax on fuel, is that something that you would support?
Well, that's something that others have raised as an option. I think, as a stopgap, that's one choice. But I think that revenue could better be spent, frankly, on programming that impacts everybody. Not everybody drives a lot. That's not everybody's core concern in terms of cost. But as I said, I think using that tax revenue for some of the other initiatives that I mentioned, based on our analysis, would be a better bang for that buck.
All right, so there is those out there who would say that if, in fact, we start cutting some of these fees and perhaps impacting the provincial coffers, that we're in some way subsidizing this federal tax. Do you agree with that or no?
Well, I think for one thing, it's not exactly a tax. We're trying to price carbon because we're trying to move away from the use of fossil fuels. And, your listeners will probably know that just the other day, Nova Scotia Power made public their plan to convert the Lingan generating station in Cape Breton from coal to natural gas, which doesn't get us off fossil fuels, although it does reduce GHG emissions. So, I think governments around the world are trying to figure out what the best way to do that is. So the idea that this is just a worthless tax, I think it's a little more complicated than that. I think it will hit Nova Scotians hard. And so that's why I think at the end of the day, it's not actually about pricing carbon. It's about, can people afford groceries? Can they afford their rent? Can they afford to live in this province? And so that's what we are focused on. The federal government's going to do what the federal government's going to do. And they have been really clear for a very long time what those programs are going to be. And I think it's actually very childish, the approach that the Premier and, Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick have taken. They're using taxpayer dollars to fund a partisan ad campaign that basically says, we don't like what the government's doing. It's not information. They're not giving people the whole picture. They're throwing a temper tantrum. And again, there's so many levers that the provincial government has to help people with affordability. And we really think that that's where people want their provincial government to be focused, on helping them afford the things that they need.
Okay, let's move on. And talking about childcare spaces, a release that you sent out on last week. Some pretty interesting data on this release. I'll read a bit of it. It says families are struggling to find affordable childcare, and new numbers released by your caucus through the Freedom of Information request show that so far this year, HRM lost more child spaces than were created. Only 14 new net spaces were opened province-wide since the start of 2023. Some other troubling data in this as well. What role does the provincial government have? And talk about this, perhaps dovetails back into what you were talking about with the partnership with federal government as well. But what role does the federal or the provincial government have here?
Well, they have jurisdiction over education and early childhood education. And, they've received a lot of money from the federal government through the bilateral agreement. And I think since they've taken power, we have a sort of net increase of under 30 childcare spaces across the province. Now, that's not to say there are more before and after school programs in some places. Some regions have seen a slight net increase. Here in HRM, we have actually 144 fewer spots, which is really challenging. And I think that the government has mismanaged this file. We've been saying for years, Todd, since I got elected 6 years ago, ECEs, we have a labor force issue. That is a job that is so important, that is very skilled, and that is underpaid. And we've seen that with recent labor disputes across the province. And that is true in early childcare. So there's a big labor force issue. That's one of the situations. Our real estate market is another. So people who either can't afford to retain their locations or, who for retirement or other reasons decide to sell. And we really think the government needs to step in and take a much more proactive role, because it's really impacting the labor force at large. So not only are children not getting access to early childhood education, but many parents, mostly mothers, are unable to go back to work. And I talk to people every week who say, well, I'm only working part-time, or I guess I'll try to go back to work next year because I can't find a childcare provider. A woman I spoke to recently was going to go back and do a law degree. She doesn't have care for her 1-year-old, so she can't do it. Or she can't do it full time, or, she's still searching. People are on lists for years. It's just not a situation we should have. And so, the federal government, the provincial government can do a lot with the money from the federal government to try to ameliorate this situation, but it's going to take rolling up their sleeves. And I guess, their excuse would be that their focus is on healthcare. But again, as you and I talk about, this is a health issue. We want our young children to have access to good, enriched early childhood education, and we want parents to be able to enter the labor force if they need to, or if they want to. All
right, so when this federal daycare plan, or this federal childcare plan rather, rolled out, there was a lot of criticism from some in the private sector who had daycares who suggested that this put them out of business, that it wasn't well planned, and it was had some challenges with it. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, we have an interesting childcare landscape here in Nova Scotia. So I think about half of our childcare providers are private and about half are public. And we certainly need to find a way to keep all those spaces open. There's no question. My understanding is that the initial plan that kind of would have forced a quick transition or closure of those private spaces has been on hold. But, that goes to, as I said, the management of the file. That's something that the Department of Early Childhood Education and the minister need to pay really close attention to and figure out a way forward. I know recently the government did step in and purchase a center and then transfer it to the YWCA for management, someone who wanted to get out of the business. I think that's actually a pretty good model where there are robust organizations like the YWCA who have a ton of expertise and have the capacity to take over those centers. But I think there are lots of creative options there, and we just need to know that the government is working on them and that, the thousands and thousands of parents and, again, moms, a lot of them across this province who want to be able to have a family and also have a career, especially right now when everything is so expensive and it's not really a choice in most cases for two parents to work if there are two parents in a family, to be able to do that without having to wonder how they're going to pay for childcare.
All right, so your estimation is that there's enough money here if in fact it were better managed. It's a management issue, not a financial issue. Is that what your message here?
Well, I think so. The challenge, Todd, is that we don't have a lot of transparency. So when the minister is asked about it, she talks about thousands of spaces that have been created. And this is why, this is the second Freedom of Information request that we had to file and spend a long time with to understand that, yes, spaces are opening, but they're closing just as quickly. And so we haven't had, we can only speculate that the issue is mismanagement because we have no information. It's a black box. So if the government was forthcoming and the minister said, well, we're having huge challenges because of demographics or because people are retiring or they need more money, then we would understand that. But we're not hearing that. All we know is that they're saying the sky is blue and we see rain. So they're saying we've created all these spaces and yet everyone we talk to says they can't find a space. And the numbers certainly bear that out, that the spaces aren't available. Well,
the stakeholders in the industry, the people who run these businesses in the private sector or run the centers, they would be, I would think, a good source as to what's going on here, would they not?
100%. And I think a lot of them, as I said, are struggling to find staff. Yeah. And, struggling with the current economics. And that's something that, again, we have provincial jurisdiction over early childhood education and education generally. And so that's a matter for this government to solve. And they haven't. And it certainly appears that they have abdicated because despite the infusion of lots of federal dollars, the situation's just getting worse and worse.
Okay, Claudia, appreciate your time, and we'll talk soon if we're both still working at work, I should say. In the view, I'm sure I'll be here. I know that. So
I'll be working. We'll both be working. So I'm sure I'll talk to you again.
All right, talk later this summer.
Okay, bye, Tom.
All right, take